Thanks for joining us. I'm Sarah Massler-Donar. Right now, a pair of consultants hired by the Wisconsin Supreme Court is analyzing new legislative maps submitted to the court following the decision by justices to overturn Wisconsin's current maps. The court received 7 initial submissions. They came from Governor Tony Evers, legislative Republicans, Democratic state senators, liberal law firm Law Forward, which brought the lawsuit, conservative law firm Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, a group of Wisconsin mathematics professors, and a UW-Milwaukee professor. The state's current maps are considered to be among the country's most gerrymandered. In a state where 4 of the last 6 presidential elections were decided by less than a percentage point, Republicans hold a near supermajority of 64-35 in the Assembly and a 22-11 supermajority in the Senate. Now, an independent analysis of the submitted maps shows that in most Republicans would still be in control, but their large majorities are expected to shrink. I sat down with the researcher who conducted that analysis, John Johnson, a research fellow at the Marquette Law School. Here's that conversation. Can you walk us through your methodology for this analysis and your findings?
In their ruling throwing out the existing maps, the Supreme Court laid out some criteria they would use to evaluate proposed remedial maps by. But in most cases, they didn't explain exactly how to measure that criteria. There are many legitimate empirical metrics you can use, but I tried to pick ones I thought were fair and then applied them in the same way to each plan.
Can you talk a little bit about how you use the 2022 election in your analysis?
Yeah, so one of the criteria the court said they would judge these maps by is the partisan impact that they would have on the balance of power between Democrats and Republicans in the state legislature. There's a lot of ways you can measure that. It's difficult and dangerous to try to predict the future. Instead, what I tried to do is use a statistical model to predict what the outcome of the 2022 election would have been had it been held in these proposed districts. Now, as it turns out, Republican state legislative candidates in 2022 did noticeably better than most statewide Republican candidates. And so my analysis shows that even under all of the plans that were submitted, it's more likely than not that Republicans would have held at least a 1-seat majority had the 2022 election been held in these districts. Now, of course, the 2024 election is going to be different. The general election in a presidential year is higher, the turnout is higher, and it's possible under a more competitive map we would see Democrats recruiting different kinds of candidates and funding those campaigns to a different degree. On the other hand, maybe Republican voters are more energized too. I leave it as an exercise to the listener to think about how much different they think 2024 will be than 2022.
And in your analysis, based off the results of the 2022 election, should they have had these maps, what did you find in terms of the Republican versus Democratic majority there in each chamber?
Yeah, so the map put forward by the legislative Republicans, their proposed remedial map, which is much the same as the previous map, but with the contiguity issues solved, that leaves the balance of power in both chambers roughly unchanged, so a large Republican majority in each. The plan submitted by the conservative law firm Will would reduce the Republican majority somewhat, but still leave a strong Republican tilt. And the rest of the plans would come closer to parity. In my estimate, 49 Democratic seats to 50 Republican seats in the Law Forward plan in the Assembly. And then in the state Senate, a couple of the plans actually look like they would be most likely to create a Democratic majority in the Senate. Of course, it takes 2 cycles for the Senate to completely turn over because we only elect half of them each time.
John, the Supreme Court ruled that the current districts were unconstitutional because they weren't contiguous. You just mentioned that. Now, in these proposed maps, that was really a pass-fail criteria. These maps achieved that. So putting that aside, there was a range of other guidelines. Can you break down what else the court laid out?
Well, of course, equal populations is important. That's the whole reason we do redistricting. Important to remember that. All of the plans fall within the sort of basic minimums for having equal populations across districts, although there is a little bit of variation between the plans, and I could imagine the court deciding that they care about that. The plans need to follow federal civil rights law of having the appropriate number of minority opportunity districts. All of the plans basically match the sort of current map in that regard. The court said they want plans to be compact to the extent that they're able to do so, and to avoid splitting municipalities, counties, and wards. Now, it may be inevitable that you'll have some splits, but the goal is to have fewer. And so those are the criteria that they said they would use. They didn't define exactly how to measure compactness, and there are different ways you can do it. But we see that most of these plans achieve a roughly similar degree of compactness. And then there's some variation in the number of municipalities, counties, and wards that they split.
In your analysis, you found that no map performs best across all of these criteria. How do some of the criteria actually work against each other here?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how compactness and keeping municipalities intact, sometimes they go together and sometimes they sort of tug against each other, because there are municipalities with quite irregular shapes. And so if your goal is to keep that municipality within one district, you might end up drawing a less compact map. If compactness is the thing you really care about, you might end up drawing a more compact map. So when I said that all of the plans had roughly similar degrees of compactness, there was a plan proposed by a UWM professor named Matt Petering that actually was noticeably more compact than the other assembly proposals, and did in fact split more municipalities, which I think is not a coincidence. However, last night the Supreme Court said that they would not consider the Petering map because he was not one of the original parties in the lawsuit. So that map is no longer on the table.
So we are left with 6 maps here, and the legislature does still have the ability to pass a new map. The governor could sign it, but how often have we seen this actually come to fruition in Wisconsin?
It's actually been rare over the course of redistricting history in Wisconsin, and the governor and the legislature failed to come to an agreement in 2021, 2022. So I think most observers are skeptical that they'll reach an agreement this time.
As this process plays out, what should voters be paying attention to in the lead up to the August primary?
Check and see if you have a contested primary in August for your state assembly, or if you're in a even numbered state senate district, one of those. That's been uncommon in the past in Wisconsin. Usually there hasn't been a very interesting state legislative partisan primary, but given how many of these proposed maps pretty radically change the shape of the districts around Wisconsin, I suspect many voters will find themselves with a much more interesting race in August than they're accustomed to.
All right, John, we'll be sure to put a link to your analysis on our website, but in the meantime, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Now, the consultants considering these proposals have until February 1st to submit their review. They can adopt maps as submitted with or without changes, or put forward their own. The Supreme Court said it will enact a map if the legislature and Evers can't come to an agreement. New maps must be in place by March 15th. This past week, Assembly Speaker Robin Vos slammed the proposals from Democrats as a political gerrymander, and once again threatened an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court.
There is only one map that has met the muster of the U.S. Supreme Court's test and the state Supreme Court's test, and that's the one that we proposed.
He said Republicans approached Democrats about passing new maps, but says Democrats weren't receptive. Assembly Minority Leader Greta Neubauer questioned his sincerity in a statement, saying they are open but haven't been convinced yet that legislators are serious about passing a fair map, and called the Republican map also a, quote, extreme gerrymander. And now a national Democratic law firm wants the state Supreme Court to throw out the congressional maps. Elias Law Group argues that the court's decision last month warrants replacing the congressional district maps that were drawn under the least change requirement.